Hello everyone, I'm Sebastian and this is a presentation on a little scoping study on stochastic inversion using random mixing and ECSE script for fugitive methane emissions that my colleague Lutz Kroos and I have been working on. Since Australia is part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, we have agreed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. To be more specific, Australia has agreed to implement an economy-wide target to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below its 2005 levels by the year 2030. Within Australia, Queensland is the highest emitting state and it's responsible for about 28% of the overall national emissions. That's why in its climate transition strategy, the Queensland government has set a zero net emissions target by 2050 with an interim target for at least a 30% reduction in emissions on 2005 levels by 2030. Obviously, in order to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we first need to know how much are we actually emitting. And one component of the overall emissions that is quite difficult to estimate is the so-called fugitive emissions. In a CSIRO study, fugitive emissions are defined as losses or leaks and other releases of methane to the atmosphere that are associated with industries producing natural gas, oil and coal. And this study also found that in Australia, the fugitive emissions resulting from those oil and gas producing industries are estimated to account for about 6% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. According to the State of the Environment report, Queensland's fugitive greenhouse gas emissions have increased by 79% between 2005 to 2016, and that was mainly due to the expansion in the state's coal and gas extracting industries. Those industries are still growing, so it can be expected that the fugitive emissions are also still increasing. However, as I said before, estimating fugitive emissions is highly uncertain. That's why there is an increased interest in improved estimation methods. For our little scoping study, we have teamed up with a consultancy company called Terrasana Consultants, and they have a drone that is fitted with a laser detector that can measure methane concentrations. So obviously using a drone is a rather safe way to measure methane, and it's also very cost effective and time efficient. The problem is that it only measures concentrations and it also only measures the depth averaged concentration. So here we can see an example of such a drone survey. On the left hand side you can see the actual measurements. You can see that the drone is flying on a more or less regular grid over the target area, and at certain locations and at certain times it measures the methane concentrations. So that means that all the observations represent only a snapshot in space and time. On the right hand side here we just did some straightforward inverse distance weighting to get a nice spatial interpolation of the methane concentrations. So, however, in order to come up with the actual emissions, we need the underlying flux. So this flux is obviously a time-dependent variable. However, as I said before, we have only measured concentrations at a certain time. There are further complicating factors such as external parameters like the wind speed, wind direction, the temperature, diffusion coefficient, as well as initial and boundary conditions, which we either don't know, some of them we can measure, or we have to assume them. And the way we are trying to approach this whole inversion problem is by using random mixing as a stochastic inversion approach, which we will use to simulate spatial distributions of methane fluxes. We will couple this random mixing algorithm with ECSE script, where we build a gas advection diffusion model, and so we run our inversion algorithm, and obviously we want to find methane fluxes that result in simulated concentration distributions that match the observed concentrations. The combination of ESYS, eScript, and random mixing has successfully been applied before, for example in this paper where we used it for geostatistical electrical resistivity tomography. For this scoping study, we just used a simplified first pass inversion based on a representation in Fourier space, which allows us a low pass filtering, so we get rid of the noise in the data, and it also allows a direct elimination of the surface flux from average concentrations. Again, this is another simplifying assumption and won't give us great results. However, we just wanted to check whether we can do something with those drone surveys at all. Here's an example. So that's the dataset from before, and what we did first was we upscaled it just to make it computationally a bit nicer. So here we have our upscale concentrations, and then we applied our inversion with the Fourier representation, and here you can see the results. So that's the inverted methane flux, and we had one validation point where they have observed the highest concentration. They went into the field and measured the actual methane flux with a so-called flux hood, and the inverted flux at that location was in pretty good agreement with the actual methane flux. However, as you can see, we have also simulated quite a few negative fluxes, which is obviously not very physical, and that is most likely due to incorrect boundary conditions. However, we were happy enough with those results, and we brought the idea forward, and I have applied for an advanced Queensland Industry Research Fellowship, which is currently under review, but if it comes through, that means we will get access to a lot of data, because those fellowships have industry and council support, and they are all very interested in this topic. It also means that we will have some money for more validation measurements and some individual drone surveys. So fingers crossed that this comes through and we can go ahead with that research. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I would also like to thank Terasana Consultants for providing data for this little study.